The day I died, my sister's wedding went on as scheduled. She walked down the aisle in her pristine wedding gown and said her vows to the man who had once been my boyfriend. My mother, meanwhile, was making countless phone calls that went unanswered, cursing me under her breath for being ungrateful. My younger brother sent me several messages, accusing me of being petty for remembering an incident that happened 2 years ago. Even my normally reserved father, in an unusually cold tone, said, "Tell her, if she doesn't come home today, we will pretend we never had a daughter." They didn't really care about me coming back. They just didn't want the wedding to be anything less than perfect without my approval. But I was already gone. From a young age, I had always known I wasn't well loved in this family. I remember one day when my mother returned from a business trip with 2 toys, which she gave to my brother Justin and sister Jessica. I reminded her as politely as I could that she hadn't given me one. She frowned impatiently and said it was expensive and she didn't have enough money on her for me. I was only 5 at the time, but I already had a vague sense of the emotions around me, especially when it came to my mother. Now, at my sister's wedding, my mother and some relatives made small talk before retreating to the corner to call me again. After the 3rd call went unanswered and disconnected, my mother looked bewildered, muttering, "Jasmine, I'm your mother." My brother Justin walked over, reassuring her. "Mom, don't be upset. It's not worth it. You know how Jasmine is," he said, patting her back. Finally, my mother vented her frustration to him. "Of all 3 children, I've put the most effort into Jasmine. When she was born, the doctor said she stole nutrients from your brother to survive." Those were the words I had heard her repeat countless times throughout my life, words that were often followed by punishment. They locked me in my room while I watched the rest of them go out as a family of 4. Justin tried to soothe her further, saying, "Mom, don't worry. I'll make sure she comes, even if I have to drag her here myself." He sent me more messages, each one more desperate than the last. "Jasmine, you better show up within the hour. Why are you being so selfish? You know Mom has a heart condition, and yet you still upset her. Even if you hold a grudge, doesn't Jessica deserve your blessing?" After typing, he paused momentarily, then put his phone away and turned to greet guests, not really believing his own words. Upstairs, in the bridal room, Jessica sat with the makeup artist touching up her slightly smeared eye makeup. She held onto our father's hand, her eyes glistening with tears. "Dad, can you believe Jasmine hasn't shown up yet? She's my little sister, and I really wanted her blessing on this important day," she said softly. Our father, usually stern and cold, patted her shoulder gently. "Don't worry. I asked Justin to contact her. I won't let you have any regrets," he said, his voice unusually tender. He found Justin in the hallway and with a stern expression said, "If Jasmine doesn't show up, we'll pretend we never had a daughter." Justin gritted his teeth and replied, "Dad, she's not responding to my messages. She even ignored Mom's calls." He added bitterly, "I knew it. She's always been heartless from the start. All she wants to do is ruin Jessica's big day." Jessica's wedding was supposed to be a beautiful occasion. She was marrying Steven, her boyfriend of 2 years. 2 years ago, when I first introduced Steven to my family, Jessica had fallen for him immediately. I remember how her eyes sparkled the first time she saw him. That night, she made an excuse to go for a walk with me. She bought me a bubble tea, linked arms with me, and said, "Jasmine, I really like guys like Steven. You're so talented. You can definitely find someone better. Why don't you give Steven to me?" I refused, but not long after that, Steven broke up with me. I pressed him for reasons, but he seemed annoyed, pushing me away. As I sat on the ground, my hand scraped from the rough floor, he sneered, "Do you really think I'd believe your lies? Your family told me everything." He went on to tell me how Justin had told him that I stole money from home, bullied classmates, and even had an abortion in college. My family had told him all these things while I was away buying vegetables with my mother that morning. As Steven recounted everything my family had said, I smiled bitterly. "They're right," I said. I no longer had the energy to defend myself. I never truly had deep feelings for Steven, and my family had exaggerated everything. My dearest family. Even when I was alive, no one cared. And now that I was dead, no one even knew. Steven arrived at the wedding, looking handsome in his tailored suit. He kissed Jessica's cheek gently and asked, "Has Jasmine still not arrived?" Forget about her. People like her will only ruin the day." Jessica hugged him tightly, pretending to be concerned, though she didn't care. It was no different from 3 years ago when I was recognized as an outstanding graduate. The school had asked my parents to attend the ceremony, hoping they would say a few words for a photo op. I carefully worded my request and called home, asking my mother to come. She agreed, but on the morning of my graduation, she called to say they couldn't make it because Jessica was feeling unwell. Jessica had video called me with a pale face, apologizing. "Sorry, Jasmine, I'm feeling a little under the weather. Congratulations on your graduation, though. You've always been so independent, and I know you can handle it." How could I be happy? On my graduation day, I apologized to my teachers, the school, and the staff for the changes they had to make because my family didn't come. Later, I saw Jessica's social media post, a picture of her in bed with my parents, the caption reading, "Feeling a bit sick, but my parents are taking good care of me. Such a small joy." I found out they hadn't even gone to the hospital. It was a minor cold, but they chose her over my big day. As the banquet hall played a soft piano piece, Jessica, dressed in a fishtail gown, walked down the aisle with a bouquet of white roses. After our parents' speeches, it was Justin's turn to speak. He joked with Steven, fist-bumping him on stage. "This is my one and only sister, the treasure of our family. If you dare to mistreat her, none of us will let you get away with it." Steven smiled affectionately at Jessica and said, "I could never do that." The guests applauded, warmth filling the room, but I stood on the side, watching everything with numb detachment. At a nearby table, I overheard people whispering. Didn't they have 3 kids? Why did Justin say he only had one sister? Another voice chimed in, "Oh, that's Jasmine, but what's the point of good grades when your character is flawed?" I had developed a reputation among relatives, thanks to my family's influence. Even my aunt, who had once been kind to me, distanced herself after an incident involving a toy. She had given me a plush dolphin, but Justin, used to getting his way, wanted it. When I refused, he cut it up with scissors. When my aunt found out, my mother told her that I had cut it up myself. After that, the aunt's demeanor toward me changed. She even stopped giving me red envelopes during family visits. My mother, feeling a brief pang of guilt, was kind to me for a while, but that soon faded. In our family, favoritism was clear. When Jessica was born, my father's business took off, and he believed Jessica brought him good fortune. He spoiled her endlessly. My mother, on the other hand, adored Justin. She had longed for a son after having daughters. As for me, I was born healthy, but my twin brother didn't survive past 24 hours. They saw me as inauspicious, the one who had taken his place. Growing up, I watched as anything Justin or Jessica wanted appeared on the dinner table the next day. But even on my birthday, despite my seafood allergy, my father booked a seafood restaurant just because Jessica mentioned she wanted crab. When I was 12, an earthquake hit the neighboring county. My family was napping at home, and when the tremors started, my parents immediately carried Justin and Jessica to safety. I stumbled down the stairs, crying, but no one came to save me. And that's how it was, when I was 12 and even later when I was much older. The night of my death, I was trapped in the woods at the foot of a mountain, a driver's hand wrapped around my throat. I had missed the last train because of overtime and was forced to take a taxi. At first, everything seemed normal. The driver chatted with me, making small talk, but then Jessica called. Even on the eve of her wedding, she found time to tease me. "I'm getting married tomorrow, Jasmine. I'm so excited. Thanks for bringing Steven home," Jessica said, her voice sweet and cheerful. I gripped my phone tighter, my chest tightening with anger. "Jessica, stop it! I don't want to hear your games anymore. You won. How many times do you want to play this?" Her tone remained light and carefree. "So it's settled then, right? You'll come to the wedding tomorrow. I can't wait to see you there." She hung up, leaving me seething with frustration, barely able to contain my emotions. I let out a shaky breath and glanced at the driver, who had been quietly observing me. His face, once ordinary, now seemed unsettling. "You fighting with your family?" he asked, eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. Feeling uneasy, I looked around and realized we had strayed far from the main road, deep into a deserted area. My heart raced as I tried to stay calm, asking, "How much do you want?" I hoped that money would solve the problem. But it wasn't money he wanted. My body was weak from exhaustion after days of overtime, and I couldn't match his strength. He dragged me into the woods, covering my mouth. The wind rustled through the trees, and the moonlight barely penetrated the thick foliage. He slapped me, pinched my neck, and hissed, "You slut! You regret leaving me, don't you? Beg like a dog and maybe I'll let you go." I didn't even recognize him. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling as I struggled in vain. His grip loosened slightly and he caressed my face with a chilling tenderness. "I'm your man," he whispered. A vague sense of familiarity washed over me, but my mind was too clouded by panic to place him. I managed to reach for my phone, dialing the last number I had called, Jessica's. It rang twice before she hung up, without a second thought. The man chuckled darkly and snatched the phone from me, slipping it into his pocket. Then, with calculated cruelty, he broke each finger on my right hand. His pocket also held a spring knife, and as my consciousness dimmed, I felt the blade slice through my left wrist. He dragged it across my skin slowly, almost savoring the pain he was causing. He then used the knife to cut my cheek, peeling off a patch of skin. "Let's see how you try to seduce anyone now," he spat. I don't remember if I died from the blood loss or the pain. The last thing I recalled was the cold wind on my exposed, blood-streaked skin and the distant chirp of insects. People say that in your final moments, you think of happy things. But in those last seconds, my mind wandered back to before I was 5 years old. When my mother was pregnant with Justin, she sent me to live with my grandmother in the countryside. My grandmother was the kindest person I'd ever known. She gave me all the warmth and love I would ever receive in my life. I remember the nights when she'd pick tender sprouts of Chinese tune, blanch them, fry them with eggs, and feed me. One time, when my mother called and said Jessica wanted Chinese tune but couldn't find any, my grandmother had winked at me and said, "The rain was too light this year, the tune hasn't grown yet." That taste still lingered on my tongue, but it was also the last time I would feel that warmth. My grandmother passed away when I was 5. Justin was barely a year old when my mother brought me back to live with them. I remember the look of displeasure on her face when she saw me again. "There's something wrong with this child," she whispered to my father. How could she have even harmed her grandmother? At 5 years old, I didn't understand life or death. All I knew was that the only person in the world who had chosen me, out of everyone, was now gone. From then on, I was the unwanted child, the one who never fit in, never loved. The days following my death were strange. My family carried on with their lives, unaware of my ghostly presence lingering around them. I watched as my mother called Jessica to ask what she wanted to eat when she came home. Jessica coyly requested seafood, and my mother bought bags of it from the market, even though she knew I had been allergic to it my entire life. As she walked through the market, she bumped into our old neighbor and her daughter, Coco. My mother casually mentioned me in their conversation, saying, "Unlike your considerate daughter, Jasmine doesn't even come home for her sister's wedding, and she had the nerve to bring a boyfriend along to insult us." Coco was taken aback and said, "Auntie, Jasmine doesn't have a boyfriend." My mother, puzzled, looked at her and said, "She's been working so much lately, how would she have time for that?" Coco tried to correct her. "She's always spoken kindly of you. Just last month, she bought a gold bracelet to give you when Jessica got married." For a brief moment, my mother's expression softened, but it quickly returned to its usual indifference. "Jasmine is always trying to impress outsiders," she said. "She's not like that at home." Coco and her mother eventually excused themselves, leaving my mother standing there with her bags full of seafood. When she returned home, she unpacked the groceries, got a small cut from a shrimp, and went to the living room to bandage her finger. As she did so, Justin rushed in, his face pale with shock. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling, "I got a call. They said Jasmine is dead." My mother paused, not registering his words at first. "What nonsense! Jasmine is fine," she replied, not believing it was anything more than a scam. Mom," Justin stammered, barely holding back tears. "It wasn't a scam. Dad and I both got the same call. They found her body." My mother's actions froze. Slowly, she turned to Justin, the weight of his words finally sinking in. The sunlight that streamed through the window fell over the fine lines in her face. But for the first time in my life, I saw an emotion in her eyes that resembled sadness. They made their way to the police station, 100 miles away, in stunned silence. My mother wasn't someone who ever stayed quiet for long, but now she had nothing to say. Jessica held her hand gently in the car, but my mother pulled away, still staring out the window. At the police station, they were greeted by 2 officers, one of them older and more experienced. He approached my mother and offered his condolences. We tried to recover as much of her remains as we could, but some parts were too severely damaged, he said, a hint of hesitation in his voice. My mother remained stoic. She looked at the officer and asked what was done to her. The officer glanced at his colleague, then answered, "The suspect confessed to using some of the parts for cooking." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. There was a long pause, and then my mother nodded, as though she had expected nothing less. Her calm reaction took the officers by surprise. As they left the station, I floated next to her, face to face, but she couldn't see me. "Mom, I hate you," I whispered, but there was no response. I was invisible to her, just like I had always been. I had thought that in death, things would be different, that maybe my absence would stir some kind of guilt or sorrow in them. But it didn't. My mother went through the motions of grief as if she were following a script. Even as she stood in front of my mangled body, she shed no tears. After my cremation, they took my ashes back home. My remains were laid to rest in a small cemetery on the outskirts of town, next to my twin brother, whose tiny urn had been there for years. On the day of my burial, the sky was overcast, but not a drop of rain fell. My mother stood in front of my tombstone, staring at it for what seemed like an eternity. For the first time, her face showed signs of regret, but it wasn't enough for me. It couldn't erase the decades of neglect and indifference. When she returned home that night, she sat quietly on the couch, holding a picture of me in her hands. She had retired by then, and Justin had gone back to school. My father, busy with the factory, barely acknowledged what had happened. Jessica had moved into her new home with Steven. Life carried on, and my family resumed their normal routine. But my mother's guilt began to grow. She started talking to my memorial photo every morning, wiping it clean as though it could somehow make up for years of neglect. Eventually, she called Jessica. Her tone was cold. "You haven't practiced the piano in over a year. If you still want it, I'll have it sent to your house. If not, I'll give it away." Jessica, caught off guard, burst into tears. "Mom, what are you saying? Am I not a daughter of this family anymore just because I'm married?" My mother's reply was simple. "Your room is still there, but I need to make space for Jasmine." Jessica said nothing. And for the first time, the balance of favoritism in our family shifted. My mother wasted no time. She emptied Jessica's former music room and tried to recreate my old bedroom down to the last detail, but she couldn't find the same bed and wardrobe, so she settled for replacements. She filled the wardrobe with my old clothes, even though they were outdated and no longer fit. She repaired the gold bracelet I had bought her and wore it every day, a constant reminder of the daughter she had lost too late. But none of it mattered anymore. In life, I had longed for her love, and in death, I realized that it had come too late. One day, she called Justin's school after receiving a message that he had gotten into a fight. He had attacked a classmate with a glass, injuring the boy so severely that Justin was expelled. My mother negotiated a settlement with the other family, but Justin's future was now in ruins. With no college prospects, he was forced to work at our family's factory, but his heart wasn't in it. Not long after, a tragic accident occurred at the factory. My father's hands were crushed in a machine, leaving him unable to work. My mother visited him in the hospital, but as she sat by his bed, she muttered, "Jasmine must have suffered more than this. She called for me, and I didn't hear her." Even Justin began to break down under the weight of guilt. He confessed one day, "Jasmine's dead, and it feels like nothing's gone right since. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe we pushed her away." But it was too late for realizations. Too late for apologies. I had been pushed away long before my death. The situation at home grew worse after my father's injury. Without him to manage the factory, the family business started to crumble. Justin, who had been forced to take over, was inexperienced and uninterested, leading to more problems. Jessica, meanwhile, returned home with Steven to offer help. But her motives weren't entirely pure. One day, my mother noticed faint bruises on Jessica's face. She pulled her aside and asked, "What happened?" At first, Jessica didn't say anything, but eventually she broke down, confessing through sobs, "After Jasmine's death, Stephen hasn't treated me the same. He's been angry, saying it was my fault for not answering her call that night. He even hit me." Jessica had been the golden child, the one who always received the most attention and love from our parents. Yet now, as my mother stared at her, she seemed to see her in a different light. "Was he wrong?" my mother asked, her tone cold. "Didn't you ignore her call?" Jessica was stunned, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Mom, how can you say that? After everything, how could you possibly blame me?" My mother didn't respond. She simply walked past Jessica and left the room, leaving her daughter standing there in disbelief. Later that evening, during dinner, a heated argument broke out between Jessica and Justin. They had always been close, but now they were at each other's throats, arguing about who should take control of the factory. "You've always been Mom and Dad's favorite," Justin shouted. "But the truth is, you've ruined everything. You're the reason the family fell apart." Jessica, furious, snapped back, "Don't act like you're innocent. You're the one who spread all those lies about Jasmine to Stephen. You destroyed her life. And now you want to blame me for everything?" The argument continued, their voices growing louder and more vicious. My mother, sitting at the table with her head in her hands, finally lost her temper. "Enough!" she screamed, slamming her hands on the table. "Jasmine is dead. Can't you let her rest in peace? Even the neighbors cried when they heard the news, but not a single one of you has shed a tear for her. Now you're dragging her into your petty fights." The room fell silent. My father, who had been recovering from his injury, spoke up for the first time in days. "You're taking this too far," he said. "Jasmine's death was unfortunate, but life goes on. We can't keep dwelling on it." My mother turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and grief. "You don't understand. It wasn't just unfortunate. Jasmine called out for me in her final moments, and I wasn't there. I didn't hear her." My father scoffed, dismissing her pain. "She was bad luck even in death. I've consulted a spiritual master, and he said we need to move her ashes out of the family plot. Bury her elsewhere, and our fortune will return." My mother stared at him in disbelief. "Move her ashes? You think that will fix everything?" But my father was resolute. "The master said as long as we move Jasmine's remains and suppress her spirit, our family will prosper again. She's the one bringing misfortune to us." My mother's expression darkened, her grief hardening into something more unyielding. She looked at each of them. My unfeeling father, my selfish brother, and my manipulative sister, and something inside her seemed to shift. For years, they had all blamed me for their problems. I had been the scapegoat, the outcast. Even in death, they were trying to rid themselves of me, but my mother, for the first time, saw the truth. The days that followed were strange. My mother continued her routine of tending to my memorial, but there was a new sense of purpose in her actions. She grew distant from the rest of the family, spending more and more time in my room, holding my photo and muttering to herself. One night, after another argument between Justin and Jessica, my mother locked herself in my old room. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the gold bracelet she had repaired, and began speaking to my photo. "I'm sorry, Jasmine," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You suffered so much, and I never noticed. I owe you more than I can ever repay." She reached into the drawer and pulled out a bottle of sleeping pills. For days, she had been waking up from nightmares and had been prescribed medication to help her sleep. Now she crushed the pills and dissolved them into a glass of water. The next morning, my mother prepared a large meal, a final gesture for the family she had spent her life caring for. But every dish she served was laced with sleeping pills. As they ate, my father, Justin, and Jessica grew drowsy and eventually retreated to their rooms to sleep. Once everyone was asleep, my mother walked through the house, locking all the doors and windows from the inside. She turned on the gas stove, letting the gas fill the house, and then sat on the couch with my memorial photo in her lap, waiting for death to come. I watched her from the other side of the room, my ghostly presence hovering nearby. For the first time, I felt the full weight of her grief, the depth of her regret. But it was too late. Even in death, I couldn't forgive her. As her breathing slowed and her life began to fade, I whispered to her, "Mom, why did you do this? Do you think dying will make things right? Do you think I'll forgive you?" But there was no answer. She couldn't hear me, just as she hadn't heard me when I was alive. As her life slipped away, I felt the tenuous connection between us begin to dissolve. The bond that had tied me to this world, to my family, was finally breaking. In those last moments, my mother, delirious and fading, called out, "Jasmine, are you there? Please don't leave me yet." But I didn't turn back. She couldn't see me, just as she hadn't seen me in life. As my soul began to fragment and dissolve, I floated away, free from the chains that had bound me to my past. In the distance, I saw my grandmother waiting for me, smiling as she had always done when I was a child. "I've been waiting for you," she said gently, holding out her hand. "You're free now, Jasmine." I took her hand, and together we walked into the light, leaving behind the life and the family that had never truly been mine. And so, as the final bonds between me and the life I had once known disintegrated, I realized that in death, I had finally found the peace that had eluded me in life.